It's where there's that randomized purchase, where their child doesn't know what they're going to be buying. So to give some examples would be games like Roblox, probably which is concerning because that's a game I'm aware of that's played by really young kids.
A very warm welcome to the Gambling Harm podcast. Great to have you with us for an all-new episode. And in this episode, we're going to be looking at the issue of loot boxes. And we're going to be looking at whether they are an early form of gambling and as such, what dangers they pose. Three great guests for this podcast. Dave Sproson, who's making his second appearance actually on the Gambling Harm podcast. So a very warm welcome to you, Dave, who is Epic's head of safer gambling. Jonny Peniket, who's a gaming and esports consultant, and Nathan Quarless, who's one of Epic's program facilitators and also a professional boxer. Great to have you with us, guys. I'm going to start with you then, Jonny, just by asking that question that I alluded to at the beginning. What is a loot box?
Yeah, so I think when explaining this, the first thing I say is that gaming has changed over the past 20 years and the way that games companies make money has changed. So, 20 years ago, we might have walked into a game shop, handed the money over the counter and taken home the game. And whilst that is still, it's still possible in some cases, many of the most popular video games that we see at the moment often have a free-to-play model, so you can download the game totally for free, and then the games companies will make money by selling virtual items within the game. So this is a business model called microtransactions. So microtransactions can be a whole range of things. Skins is a common one people might have heard of, where someone might pay to make their character look different in the game, to make a weapon look different in the game. But the form of microtransactions that we'll be talking about today is loot boxes. And that refers to a form of microtransaction where there's a randomized element. So when you make that purchase and when you pay, you don't know exactly what item you're going to be getting. And very often there's an item that you might want, but it could be very, very rare that you'll actually receive that item. And that's where the concern is, because it's that randomized element that creates that gambling-like mechanic.
Okay, we're going to get into that in greater detail very shortly. Nathan, I'm going to come to you to start with, really. Just tell us in a few minutes your backstory and how it led to you becoming a program facilitator for Epic and how your experience relates to this issue of loot boxes.
Yeah, so I stopped gambling in 2018, and then I was at Beacon Counselling Trust for counselling over me gambling, and then I spoke to the head of Beacon, and we done work together, and I helped set up the North West Gambling Harms Alliance, and Paul was doing one of his talks, and then I did my speech at the end, and he contacted me, and we become like friends, and he sponsored me as an athlete as well. And then at the beginning of this year, he approached me and asked me if I would finally come on as a facilitator for Epic. Yeah. And I felt like I was in the position to do so. I felt better in myself and felt more confident in myself.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until a few months ago I heard Jonathan talk about his story, about his loot box addiction, and I thought I was listening to him, and I thought that relates to me. And I felt like I needed to reach out to him and to see if he needed any help and to share my story in this part as well.
Yeah, it's funny. So Jonny was speaking. You thought, actually, this switches a light on with me because it's part of my experience. Are you able to tell us, Nathan, a little bit about your experience with loot boxes?
I'm not sure what FIFA it was. The first Ultimate Team. Do you remember?
FIFA 11 or 10 or something.
Yeah. So, we were like the guinea pigs. I always like to say it was our generation that, it was the boom in the online gaming, and we all played FIFA. And it come to a point where they brought in the free part of Ultimate Team, which was in the game. You started to buy the game, obviously, and it was like a race to get all the best players. But within the game, you had to purchase FIFA packs, and at the time it was like you have to buy Microsoft points and then you have to buy FIFA points, with the Microsoft points, and we all used to go every Friday to Blockbusters with our pocket money, or we used to sell games to Blockbusters and purchase Microsoft points, and we would just put as much money as we could into FIFA. On like release dates of FIFA, we'd all wait at midnight to get the game, and then we'd put like £150 in on the night of opening packs, and more than likely you wouldn't get anybody. I think they finally added in the probability, and it's like less than 1% to get certain players. And I think it become a real problem for me in 2018 when I had stopped the gambling. I sort of used FIFA as a way to help stop any urge I had, because it was a similar pathway for me. It was a similar feeling. So I used FIFA, and we were some lad we knew was getting Xbox cards on the cheap somehow. So we were getting £50 Xbox vouchers for like £25. So every Friday again we'd put like £200-300 worth of FIFA points in. Obviously we're getting them a lot cheaper, but we were just feeding it. And it wasn't until I listened to Jonathan I was like, I've had an experience with that.
So Dave, it was really interesting to hear Nathan say that the feeling that he got through playing FIFA was similar to the feeling he got when he was gambling. Just tell us a little bit more about what's going on there.
Sure, yeah. So there've been studies done, for example, where they had a person lie within an MRI machine, and whilst the person was in the MRI machine, they had them play a slot game. What they were looking for is the way that the brain reacts chemically when you experience a win or when you experience a loss, so that they could map the differences. And what they actually really found was that whether you had a win or whether you had a near win or a near miss, depending on how you want to look at it. And that's when you have, if you imagine reels where you want the 777 as the jackpot outcome, they would get the first reel would stop at 7, the excitement builds, the second reel stops at 7, they're now really excited, and they're waiting for that third 7, and it just ticks over to get 11 or whatever the other symbol might be. And then they get that loss, so they've not won anything. What they actually found was that over time, those near wins became almost identical to an actual win. And when you look at it on a scale, you couldn't really differentiate when a win happened and when that near win happened. So people want the anticipation. And where this works with loot boxes is the exact same way. When you're playing with a loot box, it's the anticipation. The animations within the loot boxes are designed to be visually pleasing when you watch them. And quite often, it's in video games, it's on a rarity level from legendary down to common, and they're denoted by golden as legendary, purple as epic, green as common, white as the lowest level, for example. And what they actually find is that when these animations are playing, the chemical and the anticipation is the exact same between the products. And so where the harm starts to happen is when you have, young kids that are potentially emotionally vulnerable, they're going through changes in their body at home, difficulties at home potentially as well, they're vulnerable. They use the feelings that they get from these games as a way to fill that void and a way to make themselves feel better. And I know certainly for myself, when I was opening, hundreds of pounds worth of loot boxes at a time, I was doing it because I was going through difficulties with my partner at home. I was in a job that I didn't enjoy. I was working hours that were taking me away from my family all the time. I was fundamentally unhappy. And even though at the time I knew that the money that I was spending was meant for other things and that it was going to cause harm, the temporary feelings that I would get while I was opening those boxes, especially when it was something that I would classify as that's a win for me, or I'm nearly getting there, I'm opening these purple ones, I'm so close to getting a gold one, all those worries went away.
So for that period of time, there was a freedom, but it was a bit of a fake freedom, right? I mean, Johnny, you're nodding away there. Does that resonate with your experience?
Yeah, certainly. So I started buying loot boxes. I'd always played FIFA. That was the first video game that I had. Got a games console for the first time when I was 7. Used to kind of go downstairs at 6 a.m. on the weekends when I was allowed to play, and it was FIFA because as a young kid that loved football, that was the game that I always played. And I started playing Ultimate Team when that came about in about 2011. So I should say that with the example of FIFA, Ultimate Team is a mode within the game where there are loot boxes. So packs are FIFA's form of loot box. Ultimate Team is a game mode where the goal is to build up your dream team of players. Almost if you imagine a little bit like Panini stickers or cards, but every card is usable in the game. You want to build up the best team possible. And so I started buying these packs when I was about 12 years old. I remember I first asked my dad if I could put some money onto the game because I'd basically got stuck in making progress. So I wanted to get some players from these packs, and I will always remember that he said to me that I shouldn't because it was gambling. And at the time, this was, a bit of a monstrous statement to me. I pretty quickly convinced him otherwise and said, it's just a video game. Fast forward years later, was spending more money growing up, becoming more dishonest. I'd go into, game stores like Game or HMB, and I would buy physical PlayStation vouchers that I would redeem and then hide in my room somewhere so that my parents wouldn't be aware of what I was spending, which is probably, definitely a red flag that I was starting to spend more than I knew my parents would have been comfortable with. And then I got to a point with, these two major turning points beginning to relate to what we were saying before about that feeling. So firstly, I got a debit card, which meant that all of a sudden my payments could become instantaneous and impulsive. I had access to, some savings and things for my future, money that had been gifted by grandparents. And yeah, I didn't anymore have to plan when I was going to go into town and buy these vouchers. And yeah, I then had this second major turning point, which is I went through a really difficult time as a 17, 18-year-old I had one of my parents diagnosed with cancer, amongst some other really difficult things that was going on at home. And it will always be hard to put into words exactly what that time in my life was like. But I would say that, yeah, at a point I was desperately unhappy. I was able to exchange money for this feeling, this rush that Dave's just been talking about, that was the only happiness at that point in my life that I was able to feel. And I was there exchanging money for it. And 20, 30 pounds at a time every other weekend turned into 80 pounds 3 or 4 times in one night, at the point where I was heading towards my A-levels, when I was just meant to be studying and would only be allowed on the game for 2 or 3 hours a week. And that's a point, on a slight tangent that I make actually, I say I was allowed on the game. I think a lot of people, when they first hear this issue, where they go, well, it's not necessarily the kid or the young person's fault, and it's not necessarily the game's fault, but it's the parents that should be doing more. And so I always, emphasize that point, that really, like with a lot of addictions, this was something that was secret. And I really think that at that point, my parents just couldn't have known. They were parents that, had restrictions, no gaming Monday to Thursday. They even had, filters on the internet, so I could only play at certain hours on the weekend. Yeah. So that's always a point I really like to emphasize to people as well.
Nathan, do you know what? Just listening to what you guys are saying, it makes me feel, as a parent, a little bit as though I'm out the loop in a way, because I'm thinking Christmas is coming, where there will be promotions, where lots of parents will be buying these kind of consoles for their children, and will sort of perceive it as, this is fun time, this is their time, this is time for us maybe to have a little bit of quiet time as parents, but it's a safe space. But actually, is it true to say that what you could be doing FIFA and EA have now finished their contract, but it's going to be called FC24, isn't it? That's what FIFA will now be called. So those buying FC24 for their kids may actually be handing them their first opportunity to gamble. Is that what we're looking at potentially?
I think it is a difficult one with anything. You can, there's going to be a problem. You can have a problem with a gaming addiction. You can have a problem with a loot box addiction. I think you've just got to, as a parent, manage it and make sure you're doing your best, or giving the kids the education that they need around it. I think it's to demonise it. I personally think it would make it worse, because then it's, as a kid growing up, you can't play that game. You can't. It makes me want to do it more. So I think it's got to be done in an educational point, given experiences, or it's a tough one, because if I wanted the game as a kid and I wasn't allowed it would just make me, when I got to the point where I can make my own decisions, it's only gonna emphasize it more.
Yeah, it's almost as though if you say no, that's like the forbidden fruit mentality, isn't it? I mean, John, I'm interested to ask, when you tell the kind of experiences that you guys are sharing today, and I know you've become a campaigner for this, and have been to events at the House of Lords, for example, to raise awareness. When you're telling people about the situation with loot boxes, are people aware at that level, at government level?
It's a difficult one. I think I think lots of people might not understand it fully, and as I say, I think there's a bit of a cloud with gaming. I think relatively, it's still, gaming even as a concept is something that has come on massively in the last 20 years. Everything is kind of new. We have clouds around, gaming addiction, which we might talk about in a bit, and it can be very easy for it all to be seen as a negative thing. But it's so important that we do get to that point where decision makers and policy makers actually understand exactly what's going on here, understand where the gambling mechanics lie, understand that this isn't all microtransactions, as we say. It's specifically where we have that randomized element. Yeah. And to answer the question broadly, I found that I really don't think that on the whole people do understand this issue, and yeah, especially with parents as well as policymakers. I think it's something that it's so important that we raise awareness around it.
And that raises the really important question of how you approach it, Dave. I mean, you look at the example of Belgium and the Netherlands, where I was going to say they're banned. These loot boxes are banned there, but there's a suggestion that the recommendation is that they should be banned, but it's not enforced. But why do you think that a similar approach hasn't yet been taken here?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we've been sort of campaigning for a while, is that, at Epic we feel as though everybody, under the age of 18 shouldn't gamble. But the difficulty is in the definition of gambling. And so as loot boxes currently are, because there's no cash out equivalent, there's no way for you to exchange those for real world currency. And in quite often cases, you don't directly purchase the loot boxes either. In some cases, it's a case of you purchase a currency, like Nathan said, about Microsoft points, and then you exchange those points for the loot box, that they skirt the regulation on gambling. I think the difficulty that we've got is that there's an emphasis on the gaming industry to self-regulate, without any really strict guidelines or structure as to how they should regulate. And I think, if you were to look back on the gambling industry, and if you were to give them the same premise of you need to self-regulate, would we have expected a favourable outcome from that? And if the answer is no, and we needed regulation, which we did do, we should really be taking the same approach with loot boxes. But the big challenge that we've got, and the big thing that Johnny and I are both really passionate about, and Nathan as well, is that loot boxes shouldn't absolutely be classed as gambling. There are places in the world that they do consider them to be gambling. And if you were to look at places like China, for example, specifically in China, it's a legal requirement that if they display a loot box, or if a company offers a loot box mechanic, they have to display what the outcomes or the chances of getting those rewards are. And that's not dissimilar to a slot machine that has to legally in the UK show an RTP, or a return to player table, which shows you per spin what your percentage of chances are of getting that jackpot, getting that bonus feature, or getting certain winnings.
Okay, so just to be clear, you in all three of your opinion, you would say that loot boxes are gambling.
Yeah. Loot boxes are a form of gambling. As Dave says, it's that technicality that has existed, that has meant that for years now this is something that hasn't changed. And that technicality is that the items don't hold a financial reward when you buy them. But I'll say that to a 12-year-old that might be addicted to buying loot boxes, and in the case of FIFA, they don't care whether they're getting 50 or £100 when they're spending their money in return. They care that they're going to get Messi or Ronaldo in the game. And in terms of that feeling and that rush of luck, which is, what ends up playing into that addiction, that's going to be at hand regardless of those financial rewards. And it's so important that we do move past that technicality. And in terms of, that self-regulation, there's common things that we'll hear from these games makers. One is that, loot boxes aren't a required part to play in the game. You can play the game without buying loot boxes, a very common defense that we'll hear. And to that, I'll always say that, if I have a kid's playground and I put a slot machine in the playground and I say, hold on, no, don't worry. The kids can go on the swings and they can go on the slide without using the slot machine. Don't worry about that. I think I'd probably still run into some issues.
There's such subtlety around the language, isn't there? I mean, almost to the point where it's impossible to discern from. I mean, let's take the situation, Nathan, of a 12, 13-year-old who may just have those addictive tendencies for whatever reason, and they're in this situation where they're playing FIFA. Do you think that because of this language, and because in some ways you could say loot boxes are normalised in such a way that the child themselves, who might be in a difficult situation at school, at home, it becomes a really, actually, it's a freeing thing for them. But do you think actually it's quite dangerous for kids who are in those situations?
Yeah, definitely. Especially because you're sort of building the pathway to then if you ever eventually become a gambler, then I feel like for me, I have an addictive personality anyway. The competitiveness in FIFA is to win, obviously, and to win the most games you can in weekend league. And you're coming up against, in terminology we like to use in the game world, god tier teams who have got all the best icons, all the best players. Realistically, you aren't going to get them unless you purchase loot boxes. And more than likely when you put £75 in to buy 12,000 FIFA points, you ain't gonna be able to afford players like that. You could put hundreds of pounds in, and you still wouldn't be able to afford it. The probability is so small to pack on them sort of players. It's sort of like, if you do get a Warhol, you get the excitement, and then you get an 88 rated player, but he's worth 30 grand. It's like, that's like the near miss that was done, even though you've got a high rated player, which was in the probability. Yeah. To me, that was still a near miss because, it wasn't worth anything. So that would push me on to put another £80 in, and then another £80 in, and it's like you're coming up to, 250 quid, and you're like, I need to watch out what I'm doing here. And, it gives you the same chasing feeling for me as I was gambling, and I didn't realise that until later on in my life. But growing up as a kid, obviously I didn't have the access to that sort of money, but I was putting in, I was selling games to buy points. I was all my pocket money, any money I could get hold of, me and all my mates used to do it, but it was normalised. It wasn't, we didn't know what we were doing. Yeah. And unfortunately, people with an addictive personality are going to do more than the average person.
If I could come in there quickly. Actually, I mean, there's so many, great points from Nathan that I'd love to pick up on, but I think that point around the fact that should absolutely say FIFA or FC as 24 as it now is just one example. It's certainly not the only offender when it comes to loot boxes.
It'd be useful for you just to outline games that have loot boxes, though, because there will be parents listening who'll think, actually, what kind of games do and what kind of games don't. I mean, just typically what...
It could be hard to answer in a snapshot, but I'd say that there are some really popular games that parents will certainly have heard of, like Fortnite, which actually don't have loot boxes. They have skin sales and things, and so it's that point that's really important for parents to understand. It's where there's that randomized purchase, where their child doesn't know what they're going to be buying. So to give some examples would be games like Roblox, probably which is concerning because that's a game I'm aware of that's played by really young kids. Yeah. There are then games getting older, which are big offenders like Counter-Strike. There are a whole series of games.
And when you buy these games, is there any way for those buying them to know whether the loot boxes are part of what's you're buying? Is that part of legislation at the moment?
Something which is hopefully moving forward. We're making some slow progress towards that. That looks like it might be one of the first restrictions that comes in. Yeah. But to that point on FIFA or FC, partly why we talk about that one, why that one, as with other games, can be so dangerous in terms of loot boxes, is that point that Nathan makes about what we would term pay to win. Yeah. So when you get those items in FIFA or FC's case, out of the packs, if you get a better player, then that's actually going to help you to win more games when you're actually playing the game against other people. Yeah. And what we're seeing as well in recent years, Nathan's just mentioned Weekend League there, which is what we term the esports or the competitive gaming mode within the FIFA game. And statistics like, I believe that a couple of years ago it was 7 million players were playing Weekend League, which involved at that time playing around 40 games on a weekend. I think it was upwards of 10 hours of gameplay that would require someone to be spending each week. And when people are investing that amount of time into playing the game, that can almost kind of rationalize for people in a way, well, I'm spending this amount of time to the game, I'm going to want to spend, I want to invest money in order to win more games, to have a better team, to have a literal competitive advantage. And it's almost crazy to me that is the case in this, this new world of esports where we have this place where it's just not an even playing field. You literally have someone that might come up that's not, spent any money against someone that, as Nathan says, has this super team, and that's just how it works.
Well, Nathan, yeah, go on.
I think the dangerous part of FC24 and the previous games that we've all played is, when I was growing up, it was seasons. It was just you play with Everton or you play with Liverpool. Whoever you want to play with, you play with. And there was no reward. It was just, you've been promoted to Division 1. There was no reward. It was just that competitiveness. But fast forward to now we're playing Ultimate Team. The only thing you do in Ultimate Team is to progress as your team progresses into weekend league, into divisions. You're rewarded with packs. So even if you're not buying with physical money, you're still getting the feeling of opening packs. Of I finished weekend league and getting all my packs, and I finished my division rivals. So you're getting that little boost in your dopamine, and that's where it is going to be hard, I feel, because even though you might be a gamer who doesn't buy them, you're still getting that release of dopamine within the game.
And you mentioned it, Nathan. Do you feel that it plays into you mentioned it a couple of times actually, the competitive spirit? You're with your mates, you go to school the next day, how are you doing? When you're a competitive athlete, it's almost as though it's aimed at specifically that characteristic that is such an advantage for you as a professional boxer. But in this context, it's almost as though it's a dangerous thing. Is that what you feel?
I think so, yeah. Even like up until the past few years, this is the first year I've not played it, but my mates still play. We're 28, we're not youngsters anymore, but we're still putting like pictures in the group chat of how they've done in weekend league, putting pictures of the teams and showing what players they've got, playing what packs they've got. And I think gaming as a whole is hard for me because I can get, like I've said before, I have got an addictive personality, and when I zone into something, I can't do anything else really. I know I've got my boxing, but I think boxing sort of like, I've said it before in a past interview, with like Call of Duty and stuff, I can just zone in and Call of Duty becomes like the main focus, and training sort of still do the training, but in the back of my mind I need to get home for Call of Duty. And FIFA's the same, but FIFA's different because you obviously spend the money on the game.
I mean, we were talking just a bit before we started the podcast, Dave, about the psychology behind it, and there's a fair bit of research that goes into how these games are set up and the wiring of those who'll be playing them, isn't there?
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, obviously, whenever anybody develops a game, they want it to be the best-selling game that it can be.
Yeah.
And that there's profit involved. But where the psychology comes in is when you look at games that are free to play, for example, like Johnny said earlier, where they release the game completely for free, you have to ask yourself, why would somebody release a game that they believe is going to be the best game completely for free? There has to be a financial reason behind it. And where this comes in is in the form of microtransactions. And, we've alluded to it today, not all microtransactions are loot boxes. And the psychology is when you look at a loot box reveal, or like I said before, you look at a casino win. When you play a casino game or a slot game, for example, specifically, to win your money, you want the bonus feature on that slot game. And that's usually around getting a certain symbols on the game to unlock a bonus feature, which you play a version of a mini game. And when you play that version of a mini game, the allure of it is that it's skill-based. We all know that when you play a slot machine, there is no skill to it. You press spin, you either win or you lose. But when there's a mini game involved, people automatically then assume that if there's 3 picks on the screen and you have to pick one of them, you think it's skill-based because you think, right, I'm going to pick the right one. And you think that your choice matters, when in reality, quite often at the point of pressing spin, your outcome has been determined already. The only thing that you are doing is playing through an animation that has been designed specifically to make that appealing to you. And when you look at loot boxes, it's the exact same. When you have a loot box, quite often there's a reveal, and it can be a box opening, and there's colours that shoot out, and the colours can change from purple to red to green, and usually they start off really quickly.
It's designed to be aesthetically very
exactly
appealing.
Yeah. And it's the colours will shoot out the box, and it'll cycle very quickly at the beginning, like gold, purple, green, and then it'll slow down, and it'll be gold, purple, and green, and it's very similar to Family Fortunes and things like that, where they have the big wheels that spin. Yeah. and you're waiting for that needle to stop on the jackpot, and then it just ticks over into the lose, and it's that anticipation. And all of the games and the mechanics and the loot boxes, whether that's a slot machine or whether that's a loot box, is specifically designed by experts in the field, where, you know, some of these companies have hired, you know, people that are specialists in brain chemistry to look at these mechanics and say, you know, that's going to be a really appealing mechanic. Nobody's going to want to design a game that isn't appealing. You know, they want it to be appealing. They want more people to spend money. And I think where the importance lies with this is about doing so safely. You know, loot boxes, like with gambling, isn't inherently bad. There's nothing wrong with gambling. There's nothing wrong with loot boxes. For the majority, for 99% of people, loot boxes are just an addition to gameplay. Like with people that enjoy watching football, they might have a bet on a Saturday or a Sunday or whenever they watch football that just is part of that. It's not the reason they watch football. And where things start to change and where things really change with me is when I noticed that my mentality and my psychology had completely changed. I played games in the beginning because I enjoyed playing the game. Towards the end of it, I didn't really play the game. I would log on, I would use whatever offers they'd sent me in an email as a way to get me to spend more money, open my packs, and then I would close the game. I wouldn't actually play the game anymore. And that's where there's a huge red flag, should have been for me at the time, is that, why am I doing this? Because I'm not doing it for that enjoyment anymore. And obviously, you know, talking of psychology, that's where my mentality completely changed.
You know what, Dave, like, totally in my experience as well, I think it was, I've always growing up, the thing that my parents were concerned about was whether I'd be addicted to gaming. And I think gaming addiction is a really important conversation that we're seeing arise more and more, but it's important to say that that's a separate conversation. I would say actually that at the point when my spending was totally out of control, I don't think I was addicted to the game. I don't think I was addicted to gaming. What I was addicted to was that rush and that feeling that I got every time that I paid money to open these loot boxes, to open these packs. And yeah, at that point I might have only been spending a couple of hours and I wouldn't even be, again, playing FIFA. I would literally just be logging on, spending money, opening as much stuff as I could. And then, yeah, that would be it, logging off, as Dave says.
But doesn't the loot box give you like a higher sense of dopamine? So gaming addiction is almost that sort of ticking over. You know, I know within this aren't they sort of connected in some kind of way, because it's still a sense of actually there's something that could happen for me here, and it's could be good.
Yeah. I think it's, you know, it's the anticipation. The same with, you know, we talk about slots, and the reason being is it's the closest comparable.
Yeah.
It's rapid reinforcement. If you were to look at any sort of addiction, whether it's alcohol, whether it's drugs, whether it's, you know, gambling, the addictive behaviors are the same. An alcoholic doesn't start off being an alcoholic. They will drink a small amount that increases over time as their tolerance increases. The same with drugs. Quite often it's a small amount in the beginning recreationally, and then over time as their tolerance increases, they don't get the same feeling that they used to. And the same is exactly the same from loot boxes. You know, you will, and I'm not saying that this is for everybody, by the way. There's only a very small minority of people that get to the point that we've got to. But what happens is, you know, in the beginning, Johnny said he was spending maybe £20 or £30 at a weekend. I was the same. I would spend £15 here, £10 there. And I would justify it because I would say to myself, you know, it's only £10. I don't really drink. I don't smoke. I've got friends that drink and smoke, and they spend far more than I do. So for me to spend this, it's fine. And
can I just ask you, though, I mean, the whole thing about responsible gambling for 18-year-old adults is quite a different concept to a 12, 13-year-old child whose brain is still forming, isn't it? When you're then saying to them that they're guys who are not, by nature, they're not yet able to be responsible. So aren't they that much more vulnerable, do you think?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think, you know, the key piece for awareness is for the kids. It's to make them aware of harm can happen.
Yeah.
But the key area of awareness really is around teachers and around parents, because truthfully, these are the people that, you know, see these kids day in, day out, and you would hopefully notice. I mean, I certainly did. My behaviour would change. If you were around me on a day where I'd had a good day, to quote, and I'd got what I wanted from the loot boxes, I was in a far better mood than I would have been if I'd have spent money. And the reason for that is, for me at the time, I was spending money knowing it was causing harm. And so I had no justification as to why I'd spend that money, because it was wasted. If I'd at least got something that I perceived as valuable out of it, I would have felt better. And it's the same for the kids. You know, they go to school, and they could be opening packs whilst they're at school, before school, after school. The parents are going to see a noticeable change in behaviour. The teachers we'll see a noticeable change in behaviour. And the difficulty is around that understanding that, you know, this is gambling. When in a society where we tell them it's not gambling, the regulation tells them that's not gambling. Parents that don't come from a background like us three do, where we've grown up with video games, don't really understand it as that, and they don't perceive it as that. They just perceive it as my son likes to play Fortnite, or my son or my daughter likes to play, you know, FIFA.
There's a few things that makes me think of, and in terms of your point about it being 12 or 13-year-olds, I think it's important to say that the harm that loot boxes do is twofold. So we have the direct harm. We have essentially the human cost of what it actually looks like in a 12 or 13-year-old, for that example's life, when they might have spent thousands of pounds on a parent's credit card, and it comes to that point where the parent finds out, and what that actually looks like in that young person's life, and in that family dynamic, and the harm that causes, the financial harm and all the emotional harm. And, you know, my own devastating experience, I'm in a position where I've been reached out to, you know, with so many heartbreaking messages from young people, and it's important to understand that direct human cost. But I say the harm is twofold with loot boxes, because then what we also see is that when you have really young people, when you have children that are getting used to these mechanics, that are getting used to this variable reinforcement ratio, that feeling of exchanging money with this randomized reward, when their brains are getting used to that feeling, what we then see is many cases of people that will go on to then struggle with to differentiate, have to term, you know, more conventional gambling addictions. And so it's actually really interesting to hear Nathan's example, which is one where he says that, you know, not to put words in your mouth, but when your gambling addiction might have been more under control, that the loot boxes might have begun to escalate more, and actually to hear it that way around.
Yeah, I think with me, I seen as opening a pack very similar to a roulette wheel of the game, because my addiction was to the fixed odds betting terminals. So I only played one certain type of game within that, which was the 20p roulette in the William Hill or type game. And so when I cut that out and I began my recovery as a harmful gambler, you know, I used FIFA as sort of a way to, you know, like I said before, to you know, stop the spike in my urge. So I found it very similar. You know, you open the pack, and then you get like a tell. And for me, when I was playing the roulette wheel, I knew where it was going to come in, and knew where it. So I used to spin round and wait a few seconds. And it was the same with the FIFA pack. You could, if it flashed white at the bottom, you knew you were going to get a walkout, and it gave me that same, you know, adrenaline rush. Not to the same extent, obviously, because I was winning money, but it still gave me something where I felt like, you know, this is good. I want this more.
Just to add a bit on that, I think what we're talking about here is there's a neural pathway in the human brain called the risk and reward pathway. And it's the pathway that if you were to look in the MRI whilst you gamble, it's the part of your brain that lights up when your brain weighs up the risk versus reward when you're gambling. And what we actually find is that in males specifically, the human brain's not really fully developed until the age of 24, slightly younger in females at 21, thereabouts. And what we actually find is that when kids are exposed to these risk and reward scenarios as a minor, that neural pathway is reinforced at an early age, which actually means that as they get older, they start to seek that in other forms. And, you know, we talk about it quite a lot when it comes to drug addiction. So you'll hear people say it's a gateway drug. And by that, what we mean is things like cannabis, for example. When somebody takes that from a young age, say that, you know, you had minors taking that at around the same age, 12, 13, 14, they'll experience something that they get from it, an endorphin high or whatever you want to call it, that they won't get if they keep up the same levels. And so it's called a gateway drug, because what that does is it leads them through a gateway to other things, whether it be cocaine or heroin. And generally what you find is that people will increase the drug amounts, or increase the classification of the drug to seek the same high that they would have got in the beginning. Alcoholics do the same through alcohol. They might start off with things like beer or spirit, you know, and move up to spirits, because they chase the same thing. And it's the same with this. Is if you look at soft forms of gambling, which is, you know, I've heard people call it that, such as loot boxes, that then can progress when they get to an adult to be more conventional forms of gambling. You know, the behaviours behind it are reinforced at an early age, that it becomes a normalisation. So when they do start to do these things as an adult, it's almost normal for them. There's no perceived risk anymore. And because that perceived risk doesn't happen, that neural pathway doesn't light up, the endorphins aren't released, and so they have to do more risky things to get the same.
So potentially it's putting them on a pathway that without loot boxes and without this issue, they wouldn't necessarily be on. Is that what we're saying?
I think it's a great point. What we're really, getting at here is the fact that one of, what can be a key ingredient, as it were, in gambling addiction, one of the big red flags would be an early positive exposure to gambling. Yeah. And what we're saying is now you think of the scale of the generation of young people that are gaming and that are playing games with loot boxes in, such as FIFA. They are essentially experiencing gambling mechanics, and what that, I probably wrongly used the word ingredients in gambling addiction, is being ticked off for that entire generation of young people that are playing these games. Recently, this summer, I remember, McDonald's Monopoly, and I was sat with my friend and I was looking at the packet of my burger and I was saying, you know what, I look at that and I actually start in a little way to have that little feeling, that little rush of luck, which is that feeling that I had when I was sat opening packs, opening loot boxes on the game. But you know what, it's my job to talk about this issue and to understand this issue, and that is not the case for so many people out there, where that feeling is something that was getting cemented as a kid. Yeah. And for me, that is what is massively concerning as this generation grows up.
The NSPCC, in recent research, said that 1/3 of children who make in-game purchases every week. The research showed that girls were, in terms of girls, it was a growing demographic, but the boys were more likely to use it. But what the question I'm asking is, parents might think, "Oh, is this just primarily a boys' issue?" How do we answer that one?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure if you were to look at the figures, that you would probably find that there are more males harmed than females, or at least that we know about. And the same can be said for traditional gambling, but that doesn't mean that the figures are statistically true. And the main reason being that, as with all forms of gambling, there's almost an added layer of stigma on women. And, it's more true probably to traditional forms of gambling than it may be to loot boxes. But when it comes to esports and it comes to gaming, it's becoming more and more popular amongst young girls and females as well. And I think with that gives rise to it. I think, the key thing is not really to worry about whether it's, something that's going to affect boys or girls. It's more to do with, it definitely does affect children. Yeah. And I think, parents, if they're going to take one thing away from anything, is just that, to be aware of the harm that can come from it. When the kids are asking for these, FIFA points, or they're asking for anything that they could potentially spend on loot boxes, to just be aware that harm can come from it, and maybe do a bit of research around it.
I mean, if you look at the net revenue of EA, 20% of their net revenue, which is the best part of £1 billion, came from selling Ultimate Team packs back in 2018. Since then, measures have been taken to add preview packs, pack probabilities. Do you think that EA's hand is being forced here? And it leads to the second question, which what you just said alluded to, Dave, is how do you allow people to play FIFA but be aware that there's this loot box within this FIFA game that needs to be controlled and maybe marked as an 18? I mean, where do you start to deal with it?
So really, the one thing that I'd like to say is, in terms of these changes, such as preview packs and things that have been brought in recent years, I'd like to be very clear, these are meaningless changes when you actually look into what they do and the influence that they have on those mechanics. For example, they brought in self-spending limits that you could implement yourself. I would say immediately that's surely extremely concerning, that a game which is apparently suitable for 3-year-olds needs a mechanic where you can place a limit on the amount that you're spending. But even if we move past that, once you hit your limits of spending for a week or a month, you're then faced with 3 options. One is okay, one is review my limits, and one is ignore for 1 hour. And so if we were to take that, regulation and put that into the gambling industry, that would be absolutely laughed out. That is not, a meaningful change. And the other changes that you mentioned are basically like that, is what I'd say. In terms of the regulation, I think that what we'd hope for, as Dave says, at Epic, we believe that no one under the age of 18 should be able to gamble on anything, full stop. And we believe that loot boxes are a form of gambling. We're clear on that. And so whilst, again, what we're not saying is that people shouldn't be gaming. What we're not saying is people shouldn't be able to play these games. But these mechanics and these loot boxes in these games should see similar regulations to what you'd see on things like sports betting apps. And there should be age restrictions that mean that if you're under the age of 18, you are not able to buy a loot box. How soon we'll see that,
so
I don't know.
That's an in-game restriction you're talking about there, really. So you're not saying FC24 should be an 18 per se because it has a loot box in, but part of that game should be restricted, and parents should have the ability to just restrict that from their child's use. Is that the way to do it?
Exactly. So as you're saying, that clarity is really important. That might be the first step that we see, that every game displays very clearly if it has loot boxes in. But, children should still be able to play these games if it's a suitable age rating. For example, I believe that FC24 FIFA was still PEGI 3, but it's the sale of those items specifically that you should have to pass age restrictions in order to buy those items.
Do you think the way that Belgium and Netherlands has gone, Nathan, is by suggesting a ban on loot boxes is the way forward, or do you think that's unenforceable, and by doing that you create a reaction where kids want to play it all the more?
Unsure. I think the way we should go is not banning it completely. I think, as Jonathan said, I think the right thing to do would be the age restriction. But I would like to ask you, obviously I've got asked a question before about what to do with kids. What would your stance be on, there is no restrictions right now, so how would you proceed to, to give the child the...
Yeah. So right now I think education on this issue is so important. I talked about what that human cost looks like at that point in a child's life where they might have their spending's gone way out of control. And for every parent that faces that situation, that might have heard, one of us speak, that might have heard this podcast, that might have read a news report on this issue, I think that we hope will make, an actual tangible difference at that point in their lives. Understanding the parental controls that will lie within these consoles is so critical for parents. This is not something that's going to be immediately obvious. It's not something that's going to jump out at you. I dare say it's not something that these games want to jump out at you, but it's something they'll always fall back on as their defense, that these controls exist.
Because speaking as a parent, I mean, the number of controls with 4 sons and the boundaries that you need to put in place just for their safety, it's mind-boggling.
Absolutely.
And actually then they'll say, I can't get this, which is a legitimate something that I want to get because there's this, you put this security on it. Can you take that off? And you take it off and you don't quite know what you're taking the security off. So it's really difficult, isn't it? There almost needs to be a how-to guide for parents, doesn't it?
Exactly, yeah.
Go on. So I think part of the discussions that I've had with my son's school, for example, so my son's 8. I'm not a huge FIFA fan, never have been. My son, on the other hand, is. And I think the discussions that I've had with his head teacher and with some of the parents at his school is around, understanding those player safety, the parent controls and safety controls that you can have. Like you said, they're not inherently well known. They're not, the console doesn't jump out at you and say, you should do this. If you don't, here's what can happen. And neither do the games either. And, luckily, because of the experience that I've had, I make sure that my son has those in place. So if he tries to purchase anything, I get a notification on my phone that I have to either approve or not. It won't let him spend anything without me knowing. And I think the stance that I generally take is that I wouldn't want to prohibit the sale of loot boxes to everybody, but he should never certainly be able to do that. And it does become difficult, and it does become...
So are you talking over 18s?
Yeah, I think over 18 should be able to buy it. It's, as with gambling, you would never allow a 14-year-old to go in, even if there was safety features and play on a roulette machine. You wouldn't ever allow them to do that, but you would allow them, or you should allow them if they're over the age of 18. We can talk all day about whether or not people should have awareness of traditional gambling harms raised to them. That's a large portion of the work that we do is that. But at the same time, if you give them the right education while they're at schools, you make them aware of the harm that can come from it. You help educate the teachers so that they know the signs to spot. Schools have loads of programs around internet safety, and this should form a large portion of that. Certain schools, my son's school has days where they invite the parents in, and the parents take part in internet safety lessons for parents that are either not particularly tech savvy, or maybe older than some parents that haven't grown up with technology. It helps them to be aware of the harms that can come. And so if we do all of this, by the time that the children reach the age of 18, they should have a well-rounded understanding of that. And I'm not going to say that then no harm will ever occur, because obviously harm will always occur. But it will limit the amount of harm that can happen.
It's really helpful, actually, from a parental point of view, the education piece. Johnny, where does the responsibility lie when it comes to regulation? Should it be self-regulation? Should it be something that the government introduces?
I do believe at the moment we have a situation where the foxes are guarding the hen houses, as one of the leading researchers, David Zendel, said, with the industry being given another chance to self-regulate. There's no sign, as I say, that we're going to see any meaningful change. And I really hope that in the UK we do see changes, and more significant changes that we're beginning to see come forward in other countries. It all really lies on moving past this technicality that exists that's allowing games makers to get away with the sale of loot boxes for now, which is that technicality that the items don't hold financial value. You know, in terms of what we were talking about just before there with schools and education, Dave and I were chatting just beforehand, and actually it made me think of a particularly harrowing point when I think back, which is that when I was sat in my IT lessons at school, my entire class was on basically the web application of the game, of FIFA. And when the teacher wasn't looking at our screens, we'd be flicking onto a different tab. And everyone in the lesson, we were all opening packs within the school, within our lesson. You know, looking back, there's so many things like that I realised. Another thing would be that, I think the point I just made actually summarises the fact that, like with other gambling addictions as well, this isn't just something that was happening when I was on my console on the weekend. This was something that was consuming me, that I'd be thinking about all the time. Peer pressure is a massive thing with this. We would be sat, in our breaks at school, everyone would be talking about who they, packed is the term, who they got in a pack or a loot box that weekend, what their team was looking like. I would be planning out what my team would be all through the week and things. This was something that was on my mind all the time, not just when I was actually able to make those purchases. And there was even a point where you have what's called pack simulators. So I would have an app on my phone where you wouldn't actually, I would spend a few pounds here or there to buy a currency on this app that would allow me to simulate the process of buying FIFA packs, where I wouldn't actually be able to use the items that were involved at all. But I think that speaks to just how addicted I was to that process that we're talking about here, of sitting there and watching the animation and opening these packs. And then meanwhile, we have a situation where I talk about this technicality, where apparently it's not gambling if the items don't hold financial value. These items didn't even hold value within my game. If I got Messi or Ronaldo in this pack simulator, I wouldn't be able to use them within FIFA. But I was so addicted to this process that I was spending money to just simulate that experience.
How big a thing is peer pressure, do you think, Nathan? I know when he was talking about being with his mates here, there was a nod of recognition. Is that a really big issue for kids 12, 13, 14, 15?
I think it's a thing for everyone. Even when we were a little bit older and stuff, we're putting in our teams in the chat, and it's like, a promotion will be coming up. Maybe might have been the Halloween promotion, whatever the cards are called, spooky cards, whatever. And it would be like, I've just opened, say, £50 worth of packs, and it's like other lads in the chat, someone else opened them, to give us the excitement as well, not just them. So it will happen, and obviously it's going to be worse for kids, and it will be worse for kids now because you've got them on the mobile phones. I mean, you can open packs on your mobile, you can buy the loot boxes, so you can do it in the school surrounding, and whatever, if they have debit cards themselves or the mum's cards on it. I've plenty of time, and I've been in my partner's, or when I didn't know my own house, and I'll be lying there on the bed, and as Jonathan said, you'll be changing your team for that current method, and you'd be, I might just open 2,100 points, and which is like 21 quid, and think you get like 3 packs out of it. More than likely you were going to pack like an 83 rated player, which was worth nothing. But it is that peer pressure of your mates, and you don't mean to do it. I think it's just a natural thing, as you want to see someone open a good pack.
It's a really well made point.
It's a minefield, really, isn't it?
Yeah, you just get, because you just see that at play, and I see that at play. Well, you're right. In all of us, in many ways, isn't it? The peer pressure is a very real thing. Final thoughts, then. I mean, Johnny, you mentioned that not enough is currently being done. So how do we get to a situation where the right things are being done to protect those who need protecting? Yeah,
I think more and more people understanding the issue fully is so important. More and more research. It's almost hard to say because we now have so much compelling research that, well, one, verifies the link between loot boxes and gambling, but also that shows the scale of the harm that's being done. Yeah. We did our own research. We had our own surveys that found that 3% of all 14-year-olds and under had spent over £100 in the past month alone on in-game purchases. Now, if that scales up at all, that's terrifying. That's obviously over £1,000 a year by 3% of all 14-year-olds and under. So research continues to be really important to make that point. And yeah, I think education again is critical. Parents understanding this issue, teachers understanding this issue, and finally moving towards that point where we do get the regulations that we need, which again is that if you're under 18, you shouldn't be able to buy a loot box in the same way that you can't use a slot machine.
Dave, Johnny, Nathan, thank you so much for being here with us on this podcast, and also for being so vulnerable about your experiences, which carry real weight, and I know are significant and will help a lot of people. And thank you too for watching and listening to the Gambling Harm podcast. We'll be back with another episode very soon. Bye for now.